Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo. At the very start of 2026, the California Horse Racing Board approved a settlement agreement that permanently suspends jockey Jose Nicasio. The agreement follows a year-long PETA investigation into Nicasio's activities at unregulated bush tracks, which documented the jockey racing in dozens of unregulated races and repeatedly using an electric shock device on horses. The agreement effectively imposes a lifetime ban on Nicasio racing in California. Nicasio was the fifth leading quarter horse jockey in the state for 2025, with over $10 million in career earnings from regulated races in California. But those days are over now, and it's likely that other states will honor the suspension. PETA filed the complaint against Nicasio in July 2025 after PETA Vice President and lead investigator Hannah Shine presented evidence of Nicasio's bush track activities to the Horse Racing Board. In 2024, the board prohibited horse racing licensees, including owners, trainers, and jockeys, from participating in or attending bush track races following PETA's investigation of bush track abuses. Those abuses include rampant doping with methamphetamine, cocaine, and other drugs, the use of prohibited electric shock devices, fatal horse breakdowns, injuries to jockeys and deaths, and hundreds of thousands of dollars in illegal gambling. But Nicasio is not a unique case, and the tracks aren't unique to California. There are dozens of unsanctioned tracks across the U.S. Last year, officials in Texas took action. It was a scene that bookies and trainers will never forget, as the thud of helicopter blades, the blare of bullhorns, and incoming military-style vehicles marked law enforcement agencies' raid on Carril Machomos, a black market quarter horse racetrack on the Texas plains. For more context, we reprise this episode done after that raid that first exposed the world of bush tracks and unsanctioned racing on the PETA Podcast. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo, your host for this inside look at animal rights, brought to you by PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. On today's episode, after PETA helped the Washington Post expose the presence of a horse racing underground, bush tracks, in Georgia and around the country, Texas finally took things seriously. In a dramatic raid, a law enforcement operation arrested 14 people. The charges include engaging in organized criminal activity, money laundering, unlawful racing, illegal gambling, and racketeering. There are also illegal equine and human drugs, large amounts of cash, and about 135 grams of cocaine seized. The cocaine? To make sore horses run faster. Here's PETA's head of Equine Matters, Kathy Guillermo, to tell us more on the PETA Podcast. So, Kathy, has anything like this ever happened before? I mean, this was quite a raid.
Not since we have been working on this issue, it has not happened. As you and our listeners will recall, we did a thorough undercover investigation of unsanctioned horse racing in Georgia. And then we began to do gathering of information and visual evidence from other so-called bush tracks around the country. Texas turns out to be a big player in this world, and this raid on this particular track was part of the result of that investigation.
Tell me about the raid, because it sounds like something out of a movie. You had helicopters coming in, you had all these different law enforcement agencies. Tell me about what happened.
Well, I think it was a wild afternoon and very much unexpected by the people engaged in this kind of unsanctioned horse racing. This began with our complaint to the Texas Department of Public Safety about the dangers and the cruelty and the illegalities involved in the world of unsanctioned horse racing. They ran with it. They involved other law enforcement divisions, including the Texas Racing Commission. And on Sunday, they went into Carril Machomos, a racetrack that's outside Lubbock, Texas, They arrested 14 people for offenses that include engaging in organized criminal activity, money laundering, unlawful racing, illegal gambling, racketeering. And these 14 people were taken into custody. This followed a grand jury indictment of at least 9 of those individuals. And yes, the video that we have seen and the photographs, there was a helicopter coming in, there was law enforcement and who brought in trucks and other equipment that they needed. They also seized some materials, including a number of gambling devices and at least 135 grams of cocaine.
Now, once again, this is what is known as a bush track. It's here, it's in Texas. In Texas, racing is legal, but what is the difference between the bush track in Texas and the way the bush track in Georgia was treated? Because it sounds like this is practically a military operation when they went in and arrested 14 people.
Well, I think the difference is that we had law enforcement understanding that they actually needed to enforce the law. And I'm not sure we're seeing that in Georgia where we need to. But just to go back and explain for a moment the difference between those two tracks that you mentioned, the sanctioned racing, that is the horse racing that everybody thinks about with thoroughbreds or with quarter horses. You may see the thoroughbred races on TV on certain days. And this is racing that is governed by a set of laws in the state of Texas. Those laws are enforced by the Texas Racing Commission, to some degree at least. And this is all legal and above board. The gambling that is done at that track is accounted for tax-wise and publicly. These so-called bush tracks, or what we call unsanctioned horse racing, this is all black market stuff. There are people who bring their horses in from out of state. There's a track that is set up in 50 different locations in Texas, and they do racing that's completely underground in the sense that nobody's there to enforce the law. No one is there to make sure that the horses are being treated well, that the regulations are being followed. And it's basically a free-for-all of gambling and illegal use of drugs to make the horses run faster, electroshock devices, incredible amount of whipping that's done to get these horses to go fast.
And all this is done out in the open. I mean, it's underground, so they just don't care about the law. They just do their thing, and people come to this and they bet and they act like it's a normal track.
It's amazing how out in the open it is. And we found this at all of these bush tracks that we have looked at, that you can, and some of it's even live streamed. A lot of the gambling is done not on site, but from around the world for people who watch this on Facebook. And that leads to all this illegal gambling where there's no accountability for these funds. And all of this cruelty is right out in the open. In Georgia, we saw people shoot up the horses with cocaine, methamphetamine, Ritalin, caffeine, right before they were put into the starting gate and sent to race. The electroshock devices are taped to the wrists of the jockeys so that they can shock the horse basically the whole length of the race. It's all very open. The money changing hands by the tens of thousands of dollars, that also is right out there in the open. There is nothing secret about this. The only mystery involved here is why law enforcement, federal law enforcement, is not taking action on all of these illegal racetracks.
You know, what shocks me is your description of how the horses are treated, of course, cruelly, but they're injected with drugs, openly. People know that. People know that this is all illegal, and yet they're still betting on this. Like, oh, well, maybe I have a fair shot. If they're all drugged, I guess it's all okay. But I mean, that's the crazy thing. It would seem that it would be kind of almost a rigged game if horses are going in, they're drugged, and then you're betting on them. Doesn't seem like a fair game.
I'm not sure that we can credit people who gamble on horse racing with too much common sense in general. But having said that, it's almost as though they're betting on who has the best drug cocktail. And we know about these drugs because in our investigation in Georgia, we collected syringes that had been just casually tossed on the ground after the horses had been shot up. And we sent them to a certified drug testing laboratory, and that's how we found out what was in them. But yes, it really makes no sense in many ways. And I would say also that while these places are incredible cesspools of crime, because I don't think there's any other way you can describe it, they're also family events. They sometimes have bouncy houses for the children of the people who come to watch these races. And I don't know that I have ever seen so much violations of federal law, disregard for the safety of humans and of horses than I have seen at these tracks that goes unaddressed by so much of law enforcement. And that's why we were so pleased to see Texas officials take decisive action.
Tell me about the Department of Public Safety there, the DPS. What was their view of all this? They went in and they made the raid. What was their impression afterwards?
I think they pretty much agreed with us. We haven't spoken to them since that has happened, other than to see the paperwork about who exactly was arrested. And we'll see what happens when it comes to the trials. But they took this very seriously. And, when we're talking about the number of racetracks there are in Texas and in this country, think about these statistics. And this is why the Department of Public Safety, I think, in part, took this so seriously. There are 186 bush tracks operating nationwide. Now, this is quarter horse racing. There are only 62 regulated tracks in the country where there are quarter horses racing. And 27 of those are associated with county or state fairs, so they're only for a few weeks a year. So we are talking about a kind of racing that is dominating just in terms of numbers. It's so much more frequent than the sanctioned horse racing is. And so I think that's why law enforcement really needs to pay attention. A quarter of those 186 bush tracks we found are operating inside Texas.
I notice a lot of the names tend to be Hispanic names. Is there a charge that maybe the people who are arrested, I'm referring to, is there a charge of bias that maybe there was some kind of bias toward these people? I mean, I'm trying to imagine a defense of these people, but you have people who were involved in this activity as if it was illegal activity out in the open. I mean, you're talking about public relations people. You're talking about ticket takers. You're not talking about, they don't sound villainous.
They are villainous. They're incredibly villainous because they are overseeing racketeering, allegedly, and the laundering of money. These are some of the charges. And the incredible cruelty to the horses and the deaths of the horses, because that's what happens so often, that these horses are raced, are drugged up, they're raced, they're pushed beyond their limit, and they die. And their bodies are dragged off the track with a tractor. As far as bias, I would say if there were any bias, we would have seen law enforcement agencies in all of the states where this is taking place cracking down on it, and we have not seen that. It is an incredibly popular thing to do among the Hispanic-speaking population, but cruelty to animals knows no, race or color. This is about ending what is clearly violence and crime.
Once again, amongst the people arrested were the track announcer. They're really running a little business on social media with these unsanctioned races. And you said there was betting going on social media?
That's right. The gambling takes place not only on the track, on the race day, but over internet from around the world. And a lot of these races are televised, or when I say televised, they're streamed on Facebook posts. So thousands of people tune in from all over the Americas. And there are superstar horses, and there are Facebook accounts of the most popular horses. And I would add, too, that there's a kind of tragic crossover between the sanctioned racing of quarter horses and this cruel, illegal or unsanctioned racing, because horses who do well in the sanctioned world are very often sold to people who are going to run them in this unsanctioned world. I think what was so good about this, the charges and the arrests and the indictments from the weekend raid, is that they really did look at the people who are in charge. The track announcer, the track operator, the track security, the people who make this entire endeavor run were arrested.
Now, you mentioned how there was kind of a crossover between the sanctioned and the unsanctioned, almost as if maybe the unsanctioned tracks were like the minor leagues, or certainly an underground place where people can make money or prep to go to the, I presume, the higher purses and higher winnings at a sanctioned track. Did they arrest people who might have a foot in both, trainers and jockeys who race at those sanctioned tracks? And what kind of penalties are there for them when they both frequent the sanctioned and unsanctioned tracks? There's got to be some kind of penalties for people, because they're the horse industry, right? I mean, you don't have solely people who are in the unsanctioned world dealing in that world exclusively, right?
That's very often the case. And there was at least one jockey who also races at regulated tracks who was arrested. And following our investigation in Georgia, there were jockeys who are licensed in some states to race at sanctioned tracks who were also engaged in the racing in Georgia. But I think what we need to do is pull down this screen between the two worlds, because the quarter horse breeding and racing industry silently allows these unregulated tracks to proliferate. And they're profiting from it because they're selling their horses to these unscrupulous bush racers. And it's a complicity, it's a complacency that kills thousands of horses who are doped, they're shocked, they're whipped. And these tracks are basically anything goes. So when you have the legal and sanctioned quarter horse racing world doing nothing about these unsanctioned tracks, then they really are part of the problem. What we've been able to do is to persuade California to enact a regulation that prohibits anybody who's licensed to race or ride a horse in California or train a horse in California from participating in this world. And we are now seeing other states pick up that regulation. So we are seeing the racing industry being somewhat embarrassed into taking action about this now.
So this happened in Texas. How many other bush tracks are there again around the nation that are operating in this underground fashion?
There are, that we know of right now, 186 racetracks across the country. And that's far more than there are regulated racetracks in America.
And these are all unlawful, illegal, and very cruel to the horses.
That's right. That's right.
And so the impact of this raid, it must have reverberated throughout the country to all these underground tracks.
I'm sure that the word is out. And I'm also certain that the regulated quarter horse racing industry is paying close attention because they are, as I say, very complicit in what is going on here. And I think that this will help us encourage more states to pass the regulations prohibiting anybody who's involved in the sanctioned world from being involved or participating in any way in these bush track racing venues.
PETA has been really exposing how these tracks exist throughout the country, most notably in Georgia. The Washington Post picked up that story. But there seems to have been a reluctance on the part of law enforcement to really crack down. Is this a change? Does this represent a change in how law enforcement will look on these tracks?
That is our hope, and that is what we will not give up on working toward. We know from the Washington Post investigative story that after we broke our first investigation in Georgia, law enforcement from federal agencies had decided to do a raid on the Georgia tracks. And this was all covered in the Post, so people can Google this and see it. And there was a date, there was a time, there was a process. And at the last minute, that federal agency raid on those tracks was canceled. What we don't know is why. We don't know why they would look at racketeering and at least alleged racketeering and alleged money laundering and illegal gambling, why they would look at that and say, oh, nope, changed our minds. So we certainly hope that what happened in Texas is going to happen at states across the country.
Now, this is a different kind of racing, mostly quarter horses, different from the thoroughbreds, but people will be noticing coming up in a few weeks, the Breeders' Cup. Is there any relationship between the thoroughbred racing that is going to be taking place in a big way, the Breeders' Cup, and these kind of bush tracks?
Well, fortunately, very little. For all of our concerns about the thoroughbred racing world, which has many problems and far too many horses dying, there should not be even one death, or really, frankly, they shouldn't be racing. The two worlds have little to do with each other. Where there is crossover is that sometimes we will see jockeys who are licensed in the state of California to race both quarter horses and thoroughbreds. And sometimes those jockeys will then show up on the bush tracks. That is of deep concern to us. And that's what was behind the regulation that we proposed to the California Horse Racing Board and that they adopted to prevent that kind of crossover.
Also, there's the cruelty aspect too, because all the things that they do that are illegal in the thoroughbred racing world, they're doing out in the open in this underground racing.
That is one of the tragedies of the whole thing. That when we talk about the cruelty of drugging in the thoroughbred world, we don't usually see it. It's done behind the scenes. And of course, it's not so brazen as what we saw and what we see every time there is a bush track race. But you're right, it goes on all the time. And the use of illegal substances, the use of legal medications to keep horses running when they should be recuperating, that is a huge battle we are still working on.
Now, where the Texas Department of Public Safety raided over the weekend, that was out in Lubbock. And if you look at the state of Texas, it really is like the wide open spaces. It's the Wild West. But you said how many tracks, these underground tracks are in Texas?
There are 50 in Texas. Now, these are kind of odd businesses too, because they can pop up and disappear. So we certainly have seen a proliferation of them, especially as sanctioned racing has gone down in popularity. We see some people turning to these kinds of tracks. And of course, with no, at least until now, law enforcement paying attention, they were open and brazen about the illegalities that were going on there.
But if bush tracks around the country aren't, shaking in their boots, and certainly the 50, 60 bush tracks in Texas, they have to be concerned that the Department of Public Safety there is onto them.
A clear message was sent over the weekend. We're not going to tolerate this. And some of these charges, well, basically all of them are felonies. And so now we will await the trials and we will see what happens with these people. But in the meantime, yes, I think pay attention to it. And they should. And, everybody who has a horse, whether they're involved in racing or not, should be deeply concerned about the disease factor here, too. And that's not something that's part of what the Department of Public Safety and the Texas Racing Commission are working on specifically. But we know that equine infectious anemia is being spread by the people who are bringing horses in and out of Texas to race because they're not being required to prove that the horses don't have this deadly disease. And already 30 horses in 2024 in Texas have been euthanized because they were sick with this communicable disease. That's 10 times more than any other state.
Kathy Guillermo, PETA Senior VP for Equine Matters, on how a raid in Texas marks a first step toward ending the underground bush track scene across the country. For more, go to PETA.org. And that's our show for today. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to send a link of the show to your friends. Tell them you like the PETA podcast. Contact us at PETA.org. You can find me on X or Twitter at Emil Amok. That's EMILAMOK. Or see my vlog at amok.com. Or see my work at substack.com/@EmilAmok. Or on Patreon. Patreon.com /EMILAMOK. And get the podcast on YouTube at Emil Amok 1. Once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on your favorite podcast app or on Apple Podcasts, where you can subscribe to. as well as rate and review the show. It helps get the word out about the issues you care about. Our music is provided by Carbonworks. Check them out on YouTube. And join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.